I want to talk a little bit about what the Smart City Challenge was, what Portland's approach to it was. Spoiler alert, we did not win. I just want to put that out there right now. And then also sort of what's happening now that the challenge is done and what Portland is doing to try to advance some of the goals that that we put forward in our application. And then hopefully we'll leave time for questions for you. So yeah, the Smart City Challenge was announced by the US DOT in fall of 2015. And the idea was they offered $40 million and the Vulcan Institute, which is Paul Allen's institute in Seattle. It's an institute, it's sort of a think tank slash tech incubator that specializes around climate change and also the electrification of vehicles and the electrification of the fleet. They would kick in another $10 million to support electrification initiatives. And it was available to mid-sized cities, and the idea was that cities were supposed to offer their vision of how they would integrate advanced transportation technology and data technology into their transportation system to address congestion, safety as a driver also of economic development, and then also to transportation fairness or transportation equity. And what was interesting about the challenge was that they left it very open. On the one hand, they didn't really, most times when the federal government or when government in general offers money, it comes with a lot of strings attached. And this challenge was interesting because it was a challenge grant. They said, here's $50 million, give us your best ideas. We're not going to tell you a lot about what we want. We're not going to specify what we want to see in there. We're going to, they wanted to see some types of technology and things like that, but otherwise they left it very open-ended, which was actually unusual. And you see that more, I think in the private sector and in the nonprofit sector. And so this was really interesting, sort of from a government standpoint, to be involved in a challenge like that. I should go back and say, when we're talking about transportation technology or advanced transportation technology, it's things like autonomous vehicles, connected signals, connected vehicles, smart sensors where you put sort of sensors like air quality sensors onto street lights, data systems. It's things like cloud-based computing, real-time analytics, the integration of the data that you might get from real-time analytics into your transportation planning, certain things like that. Those were the things that they wanted to see. And so yeah, so they left it very open-ended. That was one of the unique parts of this. And then the other unique part of it was the deadlines were extremely tight. They announced it in, if I remember correctly, November, and the cities had to have their applications in or their visions really, so their visions for what they would do with this money in January. So again, there was only a couple of months, and 79 cities applied, Portland among them, of course, and which the DOT had not expected. The DOT had expected maybe like 24, 30 at the most. 79 applied, and then there were 5 finalists that were chosen. Portland was among them. And then the second round came where we again only had, let's see, the second round they announced in February, and the final applications were due in May. And so then we had to take our vision and really sort of put concrete steps behind it. We had to sort of outline the budget. We had to outline the steps we would take to implement the vision, also go into more depth about what we were going to put into our application. And in between, the Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Fox, came to all 5, there was 7 finalist cities. They said that they were going to do 5. Because they had such a huge interest, they actually expanded it to 7. So it was Portland, Austin, San Francisco, Denver, Kansas City, Columbus, and Pittsburgh. And it was Columbus that ended up ended up winning. But the secretary came to all 7 of those cities for sort of a whistle-stop tour to talk to the various stakeholders and also to sort of to raise awareness about the challenge. So that was the challenge. And it was really catalytic. In Portland, we brought together a group of regional partners, private sector partners, so regional partners like TriMet, PBOT, of course, the state, ODOT, state transportation, PSU, because of course PSU has played a very big role with the Trek Institute in terms of data and also just sort of the study of transportation. And then private sector partners like Daimler, because they have a headquarters here and are working on an autonomous 18-wheeler. There were GM, Lyft, a couple of electric vehicle companies like Genzy. So it was a very big group that came together, and our application or our vision was called Ubiquitous Mobility for Portland. And I might spell ubiquitous wrong, but ubiquitous. Portland, which we shortened to UB Mobile PDX. And there were sort of 2 main components to our application. One was an integrated, what we called mobility marketplace. So we wanted to take all of the various, allow people to see all of the various transit options that were available to them. So bus, taxi, TNC, so in other words, Lyft and Uber, sort of private for hire, bike share, transit, TriMet, streetcar, so that in the palm of their hand through an application, you sort of think of a mobile app, they could see all of their transit options. And then also the costs of each. So, what would it cost to take a car share as opposed to get on the streetcar? And then also the impacts of those various transit options. So what would be the environmental impact? What would be the public health impact of all of that? The idea being that with all of that data in one place, you make it easier for people to be able to see what their transit options are. And then the idea also would be that with that application, you would also be able to pay. You'd be able to move from one transportation option to the other. With that, right now you can get on TriMet and you can transfer to other parts of the TriMet, but you can't use that to necessarily grab a Lyft or an Uber because then you have to pay with another app. Same with bike share and stuff like that. The idea would be is that you could use one application and move seamlessly through these various transportation choices. So that was sort of this mobility marketplace. And then that was connected to a cloud which would integrate all of the various sources of data that you get from those various systems, so from transit, from TNCs, from bike share, sort of bring all of that data in, also the data from the individual consumers' choices that they're making, and then use that for a variety of purposes. So one is all of that data can help planning, can help long-range planning, because of course you get you get a very rich selection of user data. So I'll give you an example. A real example is, has anyone used Biketown? How many people have used Biketown at all? Bike share, one. So, those bikes that we have all of the technology on the bike. So both the locking technology and also the GPS technology. And so those things generate a lot of trip user data. So we can tell where people are going. It's anonymized, of course. But you can tell where people are going, what routes they're choosing. So it's super rich. It's actually really hard to get that data otherwise. You have to, go out into the field, you have to do lots of observations, but those Biketown bikes are throwing off that data all the time. And for planners, it makes it really interesting because you get a sense of where are people going? When they're choosing where to ride, what routes are they choosing? And you can sort of infer from that what they think are comfortable bike facilities, the areas that they're potentially avoiding. And so from a planning standpoint, when you're thinking about, well, where do we want to concentrate our resources in terms of putting in new bike facilities, that's a really rich source of data. And the idea behind our IIB Mobile PDX was to take all sources of data like that and integrate it into sort of a central cloud where then our transportation planners would have access to that. Also, you could make available some of that data and also some of the real-time data then to private app developers so that they could use that to put together apps that would potentially help folks in other ways in terms of transportation. So that was sort of the mobility marketplace, the app side of things, and the technology side of things. Then we had an infrastructure side of things where we wanted to focus on 3 corridors. And this is one of the things I think that made Portland's application unique. Most of the other cities focused on their downtown. We specifically did not. Instead, we chose 3 corridors. One, of course, links to downtown, Division and Powell. The other 2 don't really. We wanted, and that choice was conscious because part of Portland's application, and I think what also we felt set us apart, obviously didn't set us apart enough because we didn't win, but was that we really wanted to highlight the power of these types of transportation technologies and data technology to address transportation inequities. And Portland has a very checkered history when it comes to just a very checkered racial history in general, but it also has a very checkered history in terms of transportation and race. And when you think about when they built the 5, they built that right through the heart of one of the Portland's vibrant African American community, displaced many families, and really cut out the heart of the community. And of course those wounds are still felt and still influence public policy. So you had that history there. Then you have the fact that Portland is growing by leaps and bounds. We're seeing a lot of displacement because of that growth, because of gentrification. A lot of that is happening here in the central city, and people are being forced out to the outskirts of Portland. It just so happens that out here, the transportation options are less dense, so you don't have as many transportation options out here. And also, this is also the place where it's not as safe. If you live in outer East Portland, the likelihood of being killed on the roads is 2.5 times higher than people who don't live in East Portland, right? So this is an unsafe, less transportation friendly. So that's an equity issue as well. And so we really wanted to demonstrate the power of this technology to address that legacy of transportation inequity, and also to address the real, right now, transportation inequities, which is why we chose the corridors that we did, especially 122nd, right? So huge, very important north-south corridor, one of the unsafest corridors in the city. It's one of our high crash corridors. It's the term we use for our 10 most dangerous corridors. Also, the population of the various communities is very diverse, both economically and ethnically. And the transportation connections along here are okay, but not the greatest. You have Columbia, right? Of course, one of the most important freight corridors in the city. huge amount of, all along here, both north and south of it, are a tremendous amount of jobs, right? The transportation connections to Columbia are actually not so good. And then, of course, you have Division Powell, again, going from outer East Portland into downtown, one of the most important east-west arteries, again, very, very diverse all along here. There are a bunch of very, sort of job generators, schools, and things like that. And so the idea we proposed to put in the various, or to test the various types of advanced transportation technologies along these corridors. So along Columbia, we were, one of the things we offered was to work with Daimler and to test out those autonomous freight vehicles, autonomous 18-wheelers, along 122nd and Division, to put in advanced sensor technology in the streetlights so that you could monitor traffic, you could monitor air quality, and use that data to figure out the various impacts of transportation along those corridors. We were also going to install advanced signal technology so that you could time the signals, you could give prioritization to transit, to buses. You could also, then vehicles could connect to the signals. Is actually really cool. Some of this is already happening, and as part of our public engagement around this, we had a tech expo at OMSI, and there's this software developer, app developer down in Bend, and they can take signal technology in terms of the signal timing, and they've integrated it into this app, and it's now available in certain BMWs so that you're driving along and the car knows when the signal is about to change, and also so instead of you're driving down, you're halfway down the block and you don't know is the signal going to change or not, and so the temptation is either just to speed up and try to make it, and this sort of provides you that information and can let you know that at the legal rate of speed you're not going to make it. Also, if you're sitting at the intersection, it will give you sort of a 5-second warning that the light is about to change. So we were going to use, the idea was to integrate those sorts of things into these corridors. Another interesting thing that you can do, especially with connected vehicles, is, and if you have this sort of idea of a mobile, so you have this marketplace, this app, you can connect cars and users and pedestrians so that a car could know where a pedestrian is along the route and can give that information back to the driver, could also potentially signal to the pedestrian if they were about to step out in front of a car. So that the safety benefits of a lot of this technology are potentially very, very big. So those were sort of the two components. On the one hand, this application, this sort of central marketplace, and behind that, the cloud computing and the generation of all of these analytics, and then the testing of these various technologies on these three corridors. Another idea that we had was to use autonomous electric vehicles to augment the transit along here. So where there are places where the transit options aren't as rich, to use electric vehicles. They make these they're not quite buses, and they're bigger than vans, and they would be sort of perfect for getting people either to jobs on the Columbia corridor or getting them to transit. So that was another way in which we were trying to both address transportation equity and also address economic mobility. So, as it happens, we didn't win, but a lot of these things are continuing, and And so I want to say a little bit about that. So first of all, I think what was really important about this and what was really beneficial was that it brought all of these partners into the same room. Like I said, there's there's these processes and developments and technology. It was all proceeding, but there really wasn't any place where it was being coordinated or where all of the various agencies and some of the private sector partners were talking to each other. And so this Smart City Challenge was really catalytic in that regard because it brought those people together, and given that tight deadline, and I think the tight deadline is really important, it just like really forced people to work together and to work together really quickly. And those relationships have stayed, and the idea is that we're going to try and build on those relationships. Mayor Hales, Charlie Hales, the current mayor of Portland, was a big proponent of Smart City. Our new mayor-elect, Ted Wheeler, is also very much behind this and wants to keep it going. And so the partners, especially on the public side, are meeting, have met regularly, and will try and continue to keep that sort of infrastructure of cooperation together. That was a huge benefit. The other one was it really raised Portland's profile, I think, in this conversation about smart cities. And so we're getting invited to events like this one where we talk about what's going on. That's really important because you have to, you want to create an ecosystem of innovation. You want to create an environment that's friendly and conducive to innovation. You also want to attract the talent and ideas, right? And Portland is interesting. It's going through this interesting, I think, transition where the tech sector is growing, and now we're starting to talk about Silicon Forest and things like that. And so if you can get a really nice and ecosystem of innovation that will potentially help spur changes and throw off interesting technologies and interesting solutions in the future. So I think that was another huge benefit. It also raised our profile in terms of the federal government and in terms of grants. Portland was then encouraged by the US DOT to apply for a number of grants and programs that we maybe would have thought about applying for, but maybe not. And so that was important. We're starting to see that's starting to bear some fruit. TriMet received a grant from the federal government to expand their Ride Tap app, which is the app that they have, which shows transit options, and was sort of the foundation for what we were thinking about with our mobility marketplace. The Bureau of Transportation, we received a state grant to expand our Smart Trips program. We have what's called our Smart Trips program, and if you move to Portland, we will contact you and offer you a package of information about how to use transit, how to bike, how to walk, so alternatives to the single occupancy vehicle. And that program has been stuck from a sort of technology standpoint, has been kind of stuck in the 19th century, because it's all mostly paper and stuff like that, right? We're going to bring that up into the 21st century and start to use more, make it more web-based, make it more mobile-friendly and things like that. So that's sort of another example of what's happening. We are in talks with a consortium led by AT&T. They have these grants where they will offer some of their technology. They're called Spotlight City Grants. Well, they'll offer some of their technology to cities to install. And so you get sort of the technology for free, and then the cities install it and maintain it to put in some of these smart devices along Columbia. There would be smart street lights that would have advanced sensor technology, that would have mobile Wi-Fi technology. Part of part of our application was that we would provide at low cost or no cost smartphones to folks so they could access the mobility marketplace, right? So one of the things, it's one thing to put together a groovy app and have a really cool user interface, but if people can't afford the smartphones or can't afford the data plans that you need to be able to use that data, then you're not addressing the underlying questions of transportation equity. And so one of the things we had talked about was, providing those smartphones or data plans for free, and then sort of setting up mobile Wi-Fi hotspots where you could access the network. And so through this AT&T grant, we have the potential to start to pilot some of that. We're trying to move on a number of fronts, and to keep going with the idea of integrating and accelerating the integration of these new technologies and new ways of doing things into the transportation system. So let's see if I had anything else. No, I think that's about it. So if anybody has any questions about anything, yes?
What was it about the winning city that, I guess, made them stand out?
That's a great question. DOT didn't say anything about that, but I think when they announced the 7 finalist cities, it was a big process. We all had to put together these applications. The applications itself is, if you really want to dive into the nitty-gritty, that's available on our PBOT's website. It's like 70 pages and goes into great detail. And then the city teams had to go to Washington, D.C., and they presented over a 2-day period to DOT officials. And so when they were announcing that, Columbus announced that they had lined up something like $80 million in partnerships, right? And so, when I heard that, I thought, oh wow, that was a really sort of smart move. So in Portland, I think our strategy was, we really had this strategy of let's focus on, we wanted to try to differentiate ourselves through our mobility marketplace and this integration of the various technology and data streams, and then also by focusing on this equity component and this transportation fairness component. But when I heard that about Columbus, I'm like, wow, because then the federal government, you're saying the federal government, invest $50 million in us, and you will almost triple your total investment. And so I thought that was a very sort of strong play, but who knows? No one ever said. Yeah. Do you have a question? Okay. All right. Why did we lose? Yeah. I don't know.
I had a question. So like when you said that the bike town collects all this data about people moving around, is it taken into account that people who use bike town are not regular commuters, and those people who use those bicycles usually do not know where they're going and how they're going? They usually have no idea what bicycling is in the city. So I feel that is very inaccurate. If you're trying to get some information about what regular commuters do in the city.
Yeah, that's a great point. Although as a bike town user, I would take issue with your.
The way I see it, they look really. I
No,
don't know.
it's true, right? And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the reasons why we wanted to get, why we pushed, and we're very happy to get bike share here in Portland, is for exactly that reason, is that it gets people who haven't been biking or who have never biked, it gets them onto bicycles. We've had great success in Portland with getting to a certain point in terms of our bicycle commuter rates. We now have 7.2% of our trips are taken by bicycle, which is, in terms of bicycle commuting, leads the country. But if we really want to bend the curve, sort of over the long terms, in terms of climate emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, and also in terms of trips, we have to get more, we have to get up to 25%. And that's the goal for bike commuting. And right now, I think we have convinced sort of those hardcore bicyclists, those hardcore bike commuters, they're with us, right? And we have the infrastructure for them and everything like that. But they'll never get us across the finish line. So we have to attract more families. We have to attract more women to bicycling. And bike share is great in that respect. You don't have to worry, you don't have to make the initial investment of a bike, right? Which, depending on how, can be expensive. You can just get on, it's super easy. And so in some sense, that data is really important. That subset of the population, these people who are sort of new to biking and they're not as savvy necessarily about, I know exactly where the route is that I'm going to go and stuff like that, but that's really interesting data to us potentially. So it has value in that respect. You're right, it's not going to tell us a lot about the commuters, but we also have a fairly decent sense of like where they're at. But those other folks, we don't, and so that's why it's important. Anything else? Yes?
So the IIB mobile PDX app, is that up and running for users now?
No. So there are two sort of things that kind of come close, and one is this, like I said, TriMet has this Ride Tap app. Yeah, right? And then they're going to come out with the Hop Fast Pass. So those are the two things that come kind of close to it.
So why do you think that the IIB mobile PDX app is not up and running? Is it really like you need an investor?
Oh yeah, no. This was just this was the thing that we had proposed. Yeah. No, you would And so the way what we tried to do is we tried to differentiate it a little bit, and we were going to have sort of a almost like a hackathon, sort of a contest to see who could do it well. But yeah, you need. Because you have to integrate potentially these various platforms, and it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of coordination. So.
Yeah. So one thing that I heard you talking about is all these great ideas, that you want to see happening, and that you're kind of all over the place. It sounds like with getting all the innovation, which can be great, because you're saying, hey, look at all these possible opportunities. But it also sounds like you could be taking away from, as opposed to just focusing on one project at a time, or just a couple of projects at a time, because it definitely sounds like they're at a standstill, a lot of them, and they are not progressing as quickly as they probably should be.
Right.
So,
well, that's why we were really hoping that I think you're right that I wouldn't say that they're at a standstill, but it is sort of a question of like you need a really sort of catalytic investment to sort of get you over that initial hump, right? And this would have done that, right? $50 million plus, that would have, I think, attracted a lot of the public sector the private sector would have really jumped in, right? Because they would have wanted to be part of this. So yeah, you do need that catalyst, and that's why, of course, we were disappointed not to win, because $50 million really comes in handy. But and that's also the idea with the federal government. I think that's why this was a really smart challenge. They said, here's $50 million, almost no strings attached, because we know that we need to do something. We need to jumpstart these developments, and so because there's the infrastructure, our cities are built for the single passenger vehicle, right? Our cities aren't built for smart technology. Also, the technology is changing extremely quickly, and on the other hand, there's that, and then the third thing is we don't even know if it's going to work, right? Everyone's talking about autonomous vehicles, but are they really going to work? What will they look like? Are we just going to replace personal cars with autonomous cars, or are we going to take autonomous cars and organize them more as fleets and put them on the road that way? Nobody knows that. Everyone's sort of really uncertain. And you know, uncertainty is not necessarily conducive to focused investment, right? And I think, and so again, the federal government was saying, here's $50 million worth of insurance. Take $50 million and do something with it in a really interesting way. And so,
Yeah,
you know.
It's not only investing, you know, in the idea, it's also investing in the R&D.
Right. No, exactly. So, you know, and in the same way that the federal government, they recently, the Obama administration recently announced that they're going to, I think, designate, what was it, like a number of corridors as electric vehicle corridors, and will invest in charging infrastructure along those corridors. I think that's also a really sort of smart way. You create that infrastructure, and that will allow then electric vehicle makers to come in and be able to say, like, you know, don't worry so much about not being able to charge your car. We now have a place where you can drive it, where you don't have to worry about losing charge and things like that. Really sort of create a foundation for innovation. All right, anything else? Yes?
Do you have a personal opinion on when autonomous cars will be fully...
I don't. I was at a conference in Chicago recently and heard a really interesting talk by Robin Chase, who was the founder and first CEO of Zipcar, which is that car sharing. And she was of the opinion that they were coming in 5 years. She felt that they would be here in 5 years. And you know, I don't know. You read all sorts of things, right? It's, you know, Google at first was talking about 2020, and then they sort of backed off of that. It's really hard to know, but the implications of it are profound, and especially from you know, an infrastructure standpoint, from how the cities will look. Because if we could actually get to autonomous vehicles, and if we get to autonomous vehicles as fleets, so not, if we just take autonomous vehicles, our cars now, and replace them with autonomous vehicles, will probably make our problem bigger, right? Because you're just going to have the same amount of cars on the street and actually less people in them, you know, because one of the things that people say is, well, with autonomous cars, they could come, they could drop you off, and then they'd sort of circle the block until you needed the ride again, and then you'd have zombie cars, you'd have no people in cars, right? But if you organize it in terms of fleets, where you don't necessarily own a car, you own a seat in a car, or you own the ability to rent a space in a car that would deliver you around, we could potentially shrink the number of cars on the road, right? And that opens up all sorts of really cool possibilities, because right now, so much of our space in cities is taken up for car storage, right? If you think about the right-of-way, in downtown, you have 2 lanes dedicated to parking, okay? 2 lanes dedicated to parking. You have all of those parking garages, private parking garages, public parking garages, right? If you shrink your fleet, if you don't need that space opens up, right? And for all sorts of really interesting things. And some of it could be publicly beneficial, or some of it could not be, right? You can think of, like, think about all those parking garages. We could use that space for all sorts of things. We could use it for new malls, or we could use it for affordable housing. So it's a really profound, so on that standpoint, sort of from the infrastructure side of things and the cityscape side of things, the possibilities are really interesting. And then you have to start to think about, like, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles. It's not so much about parking, it's about places to pick up and drop off people. Right? And so there you've got to think about, okay, well, so parking lanes now, right now we store cars there. Now what we really have to think about is we have to think about places where vehicles could come in a regular way to drop people off or pick people up.
Because if there wasn't any cars in those 2 lanes, then those could be dedicated as pickup and drop off.
Right, they could be dedicated as pickup or drop off. Yeah, exactly. So no, it's really, really fascinating. So when it comes, who knows? All right. Okay, anything else? If you have any questions, if you think of any questions afterwards, feel free to email me. Like I said, the application that we sent to the federal government is on our website, and so you can always check that out.